Hello, listeners of the Mad Scientist Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cogswell, here this episode with a good friend of the show, Rob Kristofferson. Rob, how you doing, man?
I'm doing good, man. How are you?
I'm doing good. You know, trying my damnedest not to just push my head through a wall right now with the way.
I kind of feel like that's a regular thing for you, Chris. I really do.
It does. You know, it does seem that way. What was it? We had, I follow these things, the UFO community, ghost community, Bigfoot, whatever. Then also the science community. And this week has had kind of a really frustrating turn from Michio Kaku, who is one of my, I don't want to say science heroes necessarily, kind of a science communication hero, I guess. Right? I loved reading his books as a kid. He's fascinating. He's got some cool theories and ideas and stuff that he talks about in his books. But, he has kind of jumped on the UFO bandwagon kind of hard right now, and it's kind of funny seeing him and Neil deGrasse Tyson like subtweet each other in a funny way. Yeah. And like I think, obviously I think we both think that there's something to the UFO subject. You know what I mean? We wouldn't be involved if we didn't think that. Right. It's just a little what's the word? It's a little disconcerting to see. The UFO community hates you until you agree with them, and then they just love you desperately. And that's what's happening with Michio Kaku, and it's like whiplash,
It really is.
Yeah. Anyways, all right. So this episode, and really this series, we are going to talk about the world of UFO disclosure. And specifically, we're going to talk about the militarization kind of fetish that exists in the UFO world. So disclosure has been something that the UFO community, I mean, how long do you think they've been talking about this, Rob?
Oh, God. Disclosure. It's been, like a buzz term for decades now. Just, the government's got all the answers, and they're going to hand deliver them to the people. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think it's really been since kind of the modern era of UFO sightings, which I would say started around 75, 76, right around the time of the Nixon administration. That is when kind of the modern era of UFO sightings, I would consider it to have started. And that's kind of where disclosure started being a thing hard, right? And it corresponds to a view of conspiracy theories generally in the United States. So today, disclosure is really taken on a meme status of its own almost. It's almost like a doomsday prophecy in my mind. It's kind of a thing where you don't know what disclosure means. We don't know who's going to cause disclosure or what's going to bring it about, but we know that we all better be prepared for it. And it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's, Tom DeLonge will get on Twitter and say, I got some big stuff coming this week, and then nothing will happen related to Two Stars Academy, really. Yeah. But then something happens seemingly, related, and everyone jumps up for joy, and they're like, see, he told us.
Yeah. Like,
it's an...
Like, disclosure is, I call it the Book of Revelations of ufology. Really is.
Right. It's something that we think is going to happen. Or you to be a UFO theorist in some way, or to be a UFO believer, it's like required belief, right? That disclosure is coming. It's going to be great because you're going to get to tell all of your stupid friends and family members that you were right this whole time about aliens.
Right.
It's this perfect prophecy. And every time it doesn't happen, it somehow just strengthens the prophecy itself.
Yeah. Yeah, the conviction is stronger than ever. The UFO hipsters are out in full, and their theories are the best theories. And, still no disclosure has happened yet, other than the military, the Navy saying, "Oh, cool, yeah, these videos, we don't know what they are." Oh, cool,
right?
Cool, great,
right.
Really.
So, oh God, over the course of this series, we're going to talk about. We're essentially going to try to course the history of the UFO subject and its fascination with the military's involvement or potential military involvement. What are the different flavors of that theory? How did the current theory become the dominant one? And what, one part of this story that's never really talked about, but it's kind of mentioned in the quiet places, right? We mentioned it on the show a lot. I know, Rob, you mentioned it. And, I know Scott and Forrest from Astonishing Legends talk about it a lot. They did in their Skinwalker Ranch episode, obviously. Are the involvement of these kind of big figures in the subject who everyone who believes in UFOs knows about and has heard about, but the public doesn't really know them, right? And of course, I'm talking about people like Robert Bigelow or George Knapp or Harold Pudoff or Jim Semivan, right? These people who even today appear to be kind of driving the discourse as part of To the Stars Academy, from within or without, potentially. And, their story, their method of getting to where they are, and really understanding their background, I think, is super important. And it's something that, people just hear that Tom DeLonge is involved in this, and they just trust Tom DeLonge, I think, without looking at the backgrounds of any of these other people who have really been kind of skating by on their credentials since the beginning of their careers.
Yeah. An exciting development, Chris. I believe it was last week. The individual that Tom DeLonge calls the boss man. Have you heard this term?
Yep.
Did you know that he was at an Angels and Airwaves show last week?
Oh, so exciting. Yeah. So very exciting. Yeah. The boss man.
The boss man.
Yeah. Yeah. Where was that show? Do you have any idea?
I think it was in California.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Interesting. Oh, man. The boss man. Yeah. Oh, my God. So silly. All right, Jake, roll the tape. All right. So, Rob, let's start at the end, actually, I guess. Or let's start where we are today. So, recent developments that have happened, right? Okay. So, we've already talked about this on the show, but the New York Times puts out this story that the Navy has videos of unidentified flying objects, but what they're calling UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, which appears to be the military term for these things. Now, the Navy has since said that UAP can mean anything. It can mean, it's just anything we haven't identified yet, right? Which, is what UFO originally meant. It did not mean alien spaceship. So, they're categorizing things like drones and, lightning and a bug on the camera screen and whatever, right? All of those things are UAPs until they're identified.
Right.
And then they're actually, understood and you can get rid of the stuff and whatever. This New York Times article claimed that this was part of a secret government program called ATIP, the Advanced Aviation, what was it? Threat Identification Program, something like that.
Yeah, it was either aviation or aerospace, whatever one you want to pick.
Yeah, so this project was supposedly led by Luis Elizondo, and we're going to get into that as we get later on in this series, but led by Luis Elizondo, and he had since come out and started working with a group called To the Stars Academy, which was led by Tom DeLonge, Jim Semivan, and Harold Pudoff. But Tom DeLonge was the main figure out there in the public face.
At the beginning, yes.
At the beginning, it was mostly Tom DeLonge. Today, it has since become Luis Elizondo. Now, when they first came out, they said that they wanted investors to invest in their company as Type A investors, which is basically, it's almost like a Kickstarter, except if they don't meet any of their goals, they don't have to pay you back. Right? But basically what this is you don't need to hit a certain threshold to invest in this company. You can just invest as a normal person. So if you wanted to invest like $100 into the Stars Academy, you could. Although I think they set their minimum stock buy-in price is $200 or something like that. But whatever. That is really neither here nor there at this point. So the way that but buried in the New York Times story was the fact that ATIP was started because of the friendship and the urging between Senator Harry Reid from Nevada and Robert Bigelow, an aerospace executive who is interested in the subject. And to me, that has always been the central point of that story. That government corruption, I don't know what you want to call it, right? But if I could tell my friend, the senator, who I'm friends with, for whatever reason, but I give him money, right? If I could tell my friend, the senator, that I wanted something investigated, and then my friend, the senator, did investigate it, that to me seems a little bit like corruption.
Tiny bit, yeah, just a slight bit.
Right? Like a little bit. It seems like government corruption.
Yep.
And the people on the To the Stars Academy board, especially Harold Pudoff, we know this documented, this interaction or this case, is a big part of the Robert Bigelow UFO story.
Mm.
So that connection there is, I think, a very important one, but it's one that is often ignored in the UFO world, either because people don't know about this history, they don't care enough to know, or frankly, To the Stars Academy has done a very good job of controlling the narrative, kind of the media narrative around their company.
Mm-hmm.
Right? All right. Now, To the Stars Academy releases these videos of supposed aircraft or something, right? They claim they're UFOs.
Right.
The Tic Tac video, right, which is of the USS Nimitz encounter, Go Fast, and then there's another one too that they've released 3 now at this point. And that's kind of been their major contribution since then. And from that point forward, besides releasing the videos, it's essentially been Tom DeLonge on Instagram and Twitter saying something big is coming.
Yeah.
And this was the week that something big was supposed to come.
Right, because we got, word, John Greenwald from the Black Vault got in touch with Navy spokesperson. Navy spokesperson said that what was in the videos, as far as their role, the Navy's role in studying them, was not identified. They don't know what's in them.
Right. So the Navy, so I think 3 important things happened this week. The first one is the Navy came out and said to the Black Vault, and full disclosure, John is a friend of the show. They came out and said, we don't know what are in these videos. They also said that the videos were never cleared for public release, which seems like another important point that we're just all kind of glossing over, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not, this isn't the Navy saying, it's, I don't know if that's really, I don't know. It's a weird thing, right? The Navy's saying, yeah, it's out there now. We never said they could go out, but whatever, they're out there. We don't know what are in these videos. But then the Navy has also clarified to people like Glassell that, when we say something is unidentified, we don't mean that it's an alien spaceship, right? This could still be a bird or a drone or, any of the other possible explanations that are out there.
Right, and if you tell someone that something is unidentified, and you don't preface that by saying, we're not saying that it's alien, that's automatically the first thing that a lot of people go to. Oh, aliens. Well,
yeah.
No.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. And on top of that, too, the third thing I think that's important, that actually just happened this morning, is Bigelow Aerospace has gotten back into the game of UFOs now, after kind of, years of really being silent on the matter.
Mm.
And what they've released is a video, which appears to come from some kind of security cam or trail cam footage. Not really trail cam, like security cam.
Yeah.
Of inside of a room, which appears to have a table and some boxes and stuff on it.
Yep.
Where a floating orb is seen moving through the frame.
Mm. I mean, we're saying orb, but we're putting heavy quotations on it.
Yes. As anyone who listens to this show should know, orbs are the kind of famous, what's the word? Ghost hunting, bullcrap, stupidness thing, right? The orb. If the Travel Channel was gonna have a logo that didn't say, travel or whatever, it would be a ghost hunter pooping their pants at the image of an orb on a camera.
Mm.
It's like it's the quintessential ghost hunting meme. Orbs are usually just kicked up particles of dust that are reflecting the light, especially IR light, in a way that the eye wouldn't necessarily see, but which appears on camera.
Yeah. Right?
That's just the way that kind of thing happens. So the release of the orb video has been met with heavy skepticism and criticism. How would you define the release of that video, Rob?
It's ambiguous as hell. What the hell am I supposed to get from that? It's not prefaced by anything. It's just it's almost jokingly put out there. So it's Why are we?
Yeah,
why are they doing this?
The Bigelow Twitter page put out, it says our contribution, I think is what they said.
Yeah.
Right? Or our little contribution or our small contribution or something. And it's just this video. And actually it kind of plays into one of my own, in my own kind of headcanon. I like to believe that Robert Bigelow does not like To the Stars Academy and thinks that they are making a mess of this whole thing. And actually, so in my mind, I don't necessarily think they're working together. I think that they are actually working against each other in some way. But that's just my own personal kind of hope and view.
Right. Well, I mean, as much as the heavy speculation going on here, I think that's noble to think that, other than, the other side of that, which is that they're working together, which.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and there's far more evidence that they're working together than they're working against each other.
Yeah.
But, I think it'd be cool to have, the Battle of the UFO Titans.
Yeah, it'd be pretty dope.
All right, so that's kind of where we are now. And so we thought it was important to put out a series like this that we could kind of get to the bottom of some of these things. Because, I especially go out there a lot and am very vocal against I'm very vocal. I don't want to say I'm against To the Stars Academy, but I'm very vocal in my belief that you should not invest in To the Stars Academy at all. Right? You should not be giving your money to this group.
Right.
I don't care what they do. I just don't think that they should be taking people's money to do it.
Right.
And frankly, a lot of what they've put out there is the reason I think that is because a lot of what they've put out there is lacking, to say the least. But there is a lot of misinformation and just, I think, a general lack of knowledge of how this plays into the overall mythos of the UFO world, and kind of the history of the subject. And that's why we wanted to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, let's start at just the ground up stuff, right? In my mind, the modern UFO story follows closely the general feelings of Americans towards our political system.
Mm-hmm.
And that is because it gets tied very closely in hand with conspiracy theories generally, right? So public confidence in government as a whole, and this is from Pew Research, has trended steadily downward since the 1960s.
Yeah.
Especially since the mid-1960s. And that period, coincidentally, was an especially disastrous one for the American political and social landscape, right? The high point in this Pew survey that asked essentially, quote, or the number of Americans who identified themselves as trusting the government in Washington always or most of the time, the high was 77% in 1964. And that's essentially the point where we traded off from the JFK administration after he was assassinated to the Johnson administration. Since that time period, however, that number of people who consider themselves to trust the government in Washington always or most of the time has just plummeted, with small upswings in the mid-'80s and the late 90s. However, confidence, that metric, has never risen above 60% at any time since the 1960s. And currently we sit at a meager 17%. Our generation in particular has never seen a period where more of us consider the government to be trustworthy than untrustworthy. The highest percentage at that marker was 40% right after September 11th. So, since 9/11, our trust in the government has just steadily decreased.
Yeah.
And really, I think that a part of that, and I think it's really a kind of an important timeline point for the UFO community and just society in general as well, is that changeover from kind of a more trusting of the government viewpoint to not trusting the government at all. Mm-hmm. And kind of the three main reasons that that's usually pointed out, or three of the main reasons that that's usually said to have occurred, is the assassination of JFK, the disastrous Vietnam War, yeah, and in particular the Tet Offensive, right? Our government was saying the Vietnam War was almost over, and then we got, evidence, complete evidence to the contrary, that this was going to go on for a long time since then. And then the disaster of the Nixon administration and the impeachment of Richard Nixon.
Mm-hmm.
Those three events are really just that period between the mid 1960s to the mid 1970s is one that did such, kind of psychic damage to the American population that we have never trusted our government since then in any really significant way.
Right.
At the same time, that has really helped us build up the UFO mythology. Now, there's kind of, I think, three major sections of the UFO mythos, right? We often talk about them like, the period of the benevolent space brothers, the period of, the government's involvement, and then the period of, the Greys abducting people and doing scientific experiments on them, right? The guinea pig kind of movement. Mm-hmm. Rob, how would you consider this? Because I know the way that I define those eras in the UFO subject, but I guess how would you define them? And would you say there's three or there more? Like, how would you break that up?
I would start by saying from about we're beginning about 1947, and we go to about 1952 before we get to the contactees and the whole space brother thing. In 1947, and that little bit forward, we're getting ufology in its infancy because nobody really knows what the heck's going on. The government's studying it simply because they don't know what these things are, and somebody better get on it and try to figure it out. And you have the early mythos start to emerge, and then you move into the contactee age, which I would characterize from about 1952 all the way up until 1961, when pretty much the contactees started to really die down. But during that time period, it was very, how do I say, communistic in the ideals. And it's definitely the era that would put you on, McCarthy's radar, for sure.
Right.
And when you get into the 60s, things start to get a lot weirder. Like, a lot of your key cases in ufology start to come from the 60s. You get the really weird stuff with, like, the Mothman and Point Pleasant that gets tied into the UFOs that are happening there. You have a lot of just the giant juggernaut cases that, take shape and form this mythos. And then you get into the mid-70s where we bandy around the keyword disclosure, and we've kind of limped on with that for a long time. And I mean, the alien abduction stuff, that's kind of a subset of this same time period, because you have this UFO disinformation campaign that starts really toward the end of the 70s and then really ramps up in the mid 80s up until the point where you have Bill Moore, the famed UFO researcher who admitted playing a part in putting disinformation into the community. And at the same time, you have the rise of the abductees, which really begins with Whitley Strieber Publishing Communion. That's where it really hits the public consciousness, and you start to see all of these people come out and say, oh yeah, this has been happening to me since, like the 50s and the 60s, and it's happened to my parents, it's happened to my grandparents, and that mythos starts to form. But ultimately, since the mid-70s, it's the disclosure kind of movement that has pushed the field.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So the way that I would almost... I like looking at things kind of in. I'm a huge nerd, and so my brain needs classifications that I can kind of make sense of, right? And in my mind, I think the UFO subject or the field fits really perfectly in with the 5 conspiracy types that were identified by Jesse Walker, and these are the 5 types are, and I think. In some ways, those correspond. So I think that these 5 types are always kind of out there, right? Yeah. But what has happened over time is, like you're kind of hinting at, one thought or one type of thought becomes dominant in a given age, right? Yeah. So you kind of have the pre-World War II era, then you have from World War II to maybe say the mid-60s, then from the mid-60s up to maybe, I would almost say up to September 11th, and then post-September 11th is almost, I would consider that to be a new era in the field because of the inclusion of, post 9/11 almost in my mind, we have now, the idea that the government is lying to us and trying to spread disinformation, I think has become part of the mythology itself, even if the government hasn't been doing that in this era.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Right.
But anyways, whatever. We can get into that, but these 5 conspiracy types are the enemy outside, the enemy within, the enemy above, the enemy below, and then the benevolent. The enemy outside is the case where there are forces outside of your society trying to use it for some purpose that you don't necessarily know about or can even comprehend. So the perfect example of this would be the Greys abducting humans and doing genetic experiments on us for some reason. Right? Some reason that it doesn't benefit us. It doesn't necessarily even hurt us as a society. They're just using us for some reason. The next, the enemy within, is essentially an invisible force within the society working against the masses. So a perfect example of this would be the reptilian conspiracy theory. Right? The idea that there are reptilians that are acting like humans and doing things for the benefit of the reptilian society, which may or may not be good for human society.
Right. The David Icke kind of BS.
Yes. Yeah. The next is the enemy above, which is really the kind of classic conspiracy theory. The rich, those in power, are manipulating the mass population for their personal gain, right? So the enemy above would kind of, in my mind, the enemy above would be the era that we are in now, which is, or the predominant theory now, which is that the government the heads of the government, the military, our head scientists, all these other people know that aliens exist. They are trading us to the aliens for our own, for the benefit of their part of society.
Right, yeah, the whole Eisenhower treaty kind of crap.
Yeah, the Greada Treaty and all that stuff. Yeah. The enemy below is those with little power or traditional, societal push are working to overturn the social order. This is one that I think knee-jerk, we want to think that that's not one that's really popular in today's world. However, it shows up all the damn time, right? The classical version of this, I would say, is like anarchist fears, right? The anarchists are going to rise up and take over the society and ruin polite society and whatever. But a more modern version of this would be the fear over, for instance, LGBTQ rights, right? This part of society that is traditionally marginalized is trying to destroy good Christian values by, changing our bathroom signs and whatever, right?
Right.
And then the final one is the benevolent conspiracy. This is the one where, similar to, say, like ancient astronaut theories, where these something comes down and is just trying to help us out.
Yeah.
Right? They have no ulterior motives. They are just, they're like angels coming down from on high trying to help us out.
Right. Right. And you find that in like just about every single UFO account from the 50s to now, because you have these people that come and say, oh, the aliens tell us that we're sucky to the planet and we need to cut the shit. Right. And like, this persists all the way up until now. Like, you look at the alien abductees. Aliens preach the same message at different times because you have this common motif where the angels would show, or the aliens would show you, visions of the planet just blowing up and stuff like that. So
right,
yeah.
and I think at any given time, then we kind of pick and choose which cases are going to be important to us because they are the ones that fit into that kind of overall motif of conspiracy that we think is important. Right. So I would argue, and I don't know if you agree with me, but I would argue that let's say pre-World War II alien events, right, tended to be of the benevolent kind.
by and large, with
Right.
I think the only violent event that you could really look at, and you can't totally pin this on a UFO because we don't even know what the heck happened, is the Battle of Los Angeles in 1942. Nobody really knows what happened. Just a bunch of people, thought they saw something in the sky and then just started to unload rounds, mostly because a couple days before, the Japanese just bombed an oil field right off the coast of California. So,
right.
Yeah, that's really the only time when UFOs have been seen, at least in that early era, as something violent.
Yeah, and really interesting, right? So, and actually in some weird ways, right? If we look back at kind of the history of that time period and things, what we find is that in every era, and I don't think there's any more perfect example of this than the Roswell case. In every era, the cases get reanalyzed to fit into this other narrative.
Yeah.
Right? So, Roswell's a good example of this. So is the Betty and Barney Hill case. But okay, we're gonna talk a little bit more about that. But so, all right, I would say so. Yeah, pre-World War II, we're talking benevolent, right? From World War II to the 60s, what would you classify things as? How would you kind of state what that was?
Well, we're in the early Cold War.
Yep.
So we're promoting messages of peace because, we don't want nukes just dropping everywhere. So in a way, you're getting more of that benevolence. You're not seeing UFOs really doing a lot of dangerous or, hostile things. And in every, with the exception of, say, the case of Thomas F. Mantell, the National Guard pilot who was taxiing a plane back to Kentucky, and he decides to engage with some unknown object, and it's not the object that kills him, it's the fact that he has no oxygen on board his plane, and therefore he blacks out and dies. And yet, if you look at the cases of where people try to pin, the UFOs as these violent things, they're not very well corroborated, and there's no clear intention there. So up until that point, they're still pretty benevolent. And
interesting.
Yeah, that's for the most part, it's a benign phenomenon. People are, reporting all of these sightings for the most part, but there's nothing that's really harmful. It's all mostly benevolent to me.
Sure. So, what's interesting, though, is in my mind, at least in I would argue that in pop culture, at least, this is the era where the idea of a violent, invasive force starts to really become popular. Right. Because we're taught, part of the idea of these UFOs is that maybe they're Nazi weaponry. Right. Maybe they are, what's the word? Maybe they are, I think that this is an era where, like you said, there's certainly that part of benevolence still there. Right. But I would argue that this is kind of a transitionary period where we're shifting from the benevolent Space Brothers theories to a more enemy outside kind of conspiracy. Right. Where we're starting to think that we don't know who they are.
Right.
We don't know who they work for, but they certainly don't have our interests at heart.
Right. And I can totally see that. At the same time, and we're gonna get more into that, once you get past the mid 60s. But for the most part, they still seem kind of harmless. There's this. It almost seems like a disconnect between the conspiracy minded and what's actually being reported.
Right, the actual reported of the events themselves.
Because everything is largely benign to this point.
Which is so interesting.
Isn't it? Yeah, isn't it? Because it's it's this, separation of the two. What is and what's perceived and how it's affecting culture. And these reports are affecting culture in a different way. And I wonder if that's just the fact. I wonder if that's just almost a disparity between the way the media portrayed it, because for a long time the media just didn't take it seriously. But it's like, oh, hey, these people are still reporting these things. Well, that's pretty intense, and I mean that's going to change around the mid '60s for a short period of time. But there is this disparity between pop culture and what's being reported.
Right, absolutely. So where would you say is the point where, would you say it is in that later, like the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s to like the 90s, where this event started going from a benevolent, or maybe not benevolent's the right word, well, I think they were benevolent to some extent, but almost like we don't know what they are. Right? We don't know what their point is in coming here. But they don't seem to want to come to take over.
No.
Right? They don't seem to be a threat necessarily to the point where we start thinking of them as threatened. Right? As they're coming here to do either experiments on us that hurt us, or even that they're starting to work with our military to control us. Right? I'd argue, it seems obvious that the modern day view of what a UFO case is a lot more negative and dangerous than what it would have been at the beginning of the field.
Right. I think the real transition starts to take place toward the later 70s, when you start to see things like cattle mutilation starting to merge with UFOs. Like, that is kind of a violent thing that occurs, and it starts to become intertwined in the late 70s with UFO culture. And you have a couple of abductees who came forward during this time period and say, when I was abducted, so was a calf, and it was slaughtered on board. There were a couple of people, Judy Doherty, in her account, I believe it was 1973. She came forward in 1981 or so, I think. And there's another woman named Myrna Hansen who really hit the conspiracy wagon hard, and she was an early influence in Paul Benowitz's life, and Paul Benowitz plays a huge part in all this.
And what's interesting is too, this is the time period where, so 66, right, is the publication of the Interrupted Journey, right, about Betty and Barney Hill's abduction, where this is a time period where the idea of them, and their case was not like the average case for that time period, where the aliens were coming down and taking you on the ship and being like, look, man, we're all nude on our planet, we're having a great time, stop using nuclear weapons. They were kind of brought on, and although afterwards Betty said she had a great time in interviews and stuff, like, the event itself was terrifying for them. So it's a really interesting one. It's such a weird thing. So the time period in your mind where, so what would you say is the biggest cause, or where would you say the big shift happened where the military started to be viewed as being involved in all this?
Really, I would say probably early 80s, to be honest with you, just because of the way that the Air Force Office of Special Investigations really started to play a part in the UFO community. They started to spread information into the UFO community. There's certain hints of it in the late 70s. For instance, you have Robert Emenegger getting this footage from I believe it was the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, that they wanted him to use in a documentary that, shows that these aliens landed at a Air Force base, and, it was this peaceful thing and all that stuff. And there are certain cases where it seems like the government wanted to use some people in that way. There's a story that they actually approached Walt Disney at one point to do this, and that documentary never came to be. I think you get some hints of it in the mid to late 70s, but I think it really, becomes a big thing all the way into the 80s.
Interesting. And so what do you think was the big factor there that caused that? Do you think it was Paul Bennewitz?
I think it was the Paul Bennewitz affair. I think it was the Majestic 12 documents that were brought to the forefront in 83, I think it was. And yeah, it didn't just, hit Paul Bennewitz. AFOSI, kind of set Linda Moulton Howe on the course that she's been on like her entire life.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, the story is that Richard Doty, who is the major AFOSI player off Air Force Office of Special Investigations, who approached her after she came out with An Alien Harvest, her HBO documentary, and he wanted to produce he basically wanted the Air Force to back her in producing another documentary about the UFO phenomenon, and then they were basically going to fund the whole thing, and then they just pulled the funding, and the documentary never got made. And I mean, that's a part of it. I definitely think that the Air Force really started to ratchet it up in the 80s. But Bennewitz was a big part of that. And Bill Moore, the way that they used Bill Moore was a definite part of that, too.
Sure, yeah. So the general then trajectory of this today is essentially we have evidence that evidence. We have some evidence that the government has been involved in trying to at least obfuscate the world of UFOs since its beginning, right? We have, like, say, Project Blue Book, where, there was the whole, I'm blanking on the name right now. We talked about it in our episode on Bob Lazar, but there was a letter from the director of Project Blue Book that essentially said, my directive is to, say it's all fake, right? Yeah. Leading people to leave the team. And that's kind of led to so this distrust in the government has been there since the beginning. Interestingly, though, what it has led to in the kind of modern era is a tendency in the UFO community to go to outside sources, maybe not outside sources. I think there was a clear shift in the way that we thought about the government's involvement in this, where in the 50s and 60s, we thought that the government would give us answers if they had them.
And I also think, like, the nature of, like, because you have that government distrust at that time, but I think the nature of the distrust is different from the nature of it now. So, like, the nature in the 40s to the 50s to the 60s, up until you get to this, disinformation age, is that it's not the government is, like, purposefully putting disinformation out there. It's that the government is tamping down reports. They're hiding information that, is, legitimate from these sightings. They're just downplaying reports. That's the nature of this. And then you start to see that shift late 70s, 80s, 90s. I mean, especially big time in the 90s. How many times did the Air Force have to come out with a Roswell report? I think twice in the 90s.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a really good point you make, though. Right. The flavor of the distrust in the government changed drastically from, like you said, the government. I also think in the past there was a view that the government had a good reason for keeping these sightings down. Yeah, to
keep a hysterical population, calm. Like that has a lot to do with it. And you have figures like Donald Kehoe, a former, military official himself, saying, well, no, the government's got reports and, they're hiding things. Well, cool, man. Cool. It's all in the nature of what's being hidden.
Right. It was almost in the same way that the government hid the Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
Right. Was how they were hiding this UFO technology or this this information on UFOs. To the modern day view where the government is hiding it for nefarious purposes, And so there's kind of, I think, I don't know. I tend to think that there's kind of three, maybe not three. There's a couple of different major flavors of this modern day military conspiracy theory when it comes to the UFO world, right? There is the government is working with the aliens.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There is the government is the government has no idea what's going on.
Right.
But they are trying to keep a lid on things to keep the public from freaking out.
Yep.
Right? There is the government is trying to use their connect, and I guess this is similar to they're working with aliens. I mean, I guess maybe there's two ones, right? The third one, I guess, would be the government doesn't care at all about the alien stuff, and they're just ignoring it, right?
Right.
So there's kind of three options, right? They know about it, they don't know about it, or they know about it and they're working with them. They know about it and they're not working with them, or they don't know about it.
Well, I think there's a fourth one too, and it kind of gets into the like a little more conspiracy minded, and it's that, well, the government's working on what they're working on. So if people think it's aliens, why don't we just give them aliens just to trick them?
Yes, and that would be, I think, another. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Right, the other one would be the government is using this as a means of hiding government work.
And we know that they have done that in the past, especially when you talk about the Paul Benowitz affair. They literally, like, your Dulce base mythos comes from the fact that, I mean, Paul Benowitz was a pilot, and, you know, he had an aerospace company that helped, you know, provide technology to the government. And one day he's like, sees these lights over Kirtland Air Force Base, and he suddenly starts detecting alien signals, and they, you know, basically set up Dulce Base to make it seem like there's something going on underground. They even went so far as to put a fake crash saucer so that he would find it. I mean, we know the government has done this.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, right?
Yeah.
This whole idea and it's something else.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what all of this distrust in the government has kind of led us to, in a weird way, in today's world, is looking to private industry to answer this for us. You know, and this is one of the reasons why I think it's this is one of the reasons why I think we should call this a new era almost. You know, in the early days, we thought the government had these answers. Then we started thinking that it was religion, right? There were these, you had Scientology, you had other religious kind of space cults, right? That we thought had these answers. To then, you know, the military has the answers, but they're hiding it from us on purpose. To today, you know, who do we go to for these answers? Well, we're starting to go to private organizations, right? Gaia TV and YouTube creators and To the Stars Academy and Bigelow Aerospace and NIDS. It's a weird shift that's happened. And it's honestly, we're still really looking towards the military for answers here, right? It's people from the military, it's ex-military members that we're looking towards, but it is, you know, they're working with people that we assume or we hope are, what's the word? Independent, I guess. Yeah, would be the word to use, maybe.
Yeah.
So, Rob, if you had to describe what you would consider to be a standard UFO sighting in the 50s versus today, right? What do you think a standard one would look like in the 50s?
To be honest, I don't. If you want something, you know, iconic, it's basically someone sees a light in the sky for the most part, and that's all it is. And they, for the most part, that hasn't changed. If you want to look at the iconography of the time, like, it all depends on the era that you're in. So, like, if you're in the 50s and you're some crazy guy that comes forward and says that aliens landed on his lawn, they wanted to talk to him, and he's got, they brought him on board, And we're talking peace here. Let's promote some peace. Whereas I think the UFO reports of today, hell of a lot tamer. Like, so much more tamer that, like, I don't. It's almost like we don't accept sensationalism in them anymore. Like, as
no more black goo being fed to people.
Right. Like, they're very tame. Whereas, 50s reports, 60s reports, you don't see as many, like, we call them humanoids. Like, there were a lot of reports of that back in the day. They're very tame now.
Sure.
For the most part.
Yeah, so, no, I think I agree with you there. I think it's a shift. I think it's a shift it is a shift from anything being possible in these cases,
yeah,
right, to it almost being following a trend.
Right.
You expect it to be a saucer-shaped craft that comes down, there's a beam of light, maybe you see a beam of light, it moves erratically. In some ways it's an interesting thing that the options available to those seeing UFOs appears to have been limited,
Mm-hmm.
And maybe, like you said, we don't accept those sensational cases anymore as being true, but it's quite an interesting thing.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. So ultimately then, in all of this, kind of in the middle of all this milieu, right, we have the introduction of, I think, I would argue, one of the most important figures in modern UFO research or UFO mythology, Robert Bigelow.
Yeah.
Right? And that is going to be where we will pick up on our next episode.
Yeah. I mean, you get to talk about Big Money Bobby Bigelow. You got his early days in all this research fun, because, like, think about Big Money Bobby Bigelow. He's a behind the scenes guy. He's got some money to throw around, but the moment he doesn't like the results that he's getting, he's going to pull that money away and he's going to stop.
Bro, he is the perfect example of started from the bottom.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Now we're here.
He's
He's killing it. Now we're here on the International Space Station making weird deployable house pod things. Oh, good stuff. Anyways, dear listeners, thank you for listening to this episode here, the first in our series on the modern UFO military connection. Thank you so much, Rob, for coming on. Rob, tell people where they can find you.
Well, thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure to come over here and shoot the crap about UFOs. It's really great. It's really great. If you want to know more about my podcast, the Our Strange Skies podcast, you can head on over to OurStrangeSkies.com, where you can find all the episodes on there, all our past episodes. We have a fun little blog, and there's a fun blog post about, aliens messing up during alien abductions. It's really fun. So, OurStrangeSkies.com. We're available also on every single podcast platform.
Absolutely. Check it out. So again, listeners, that's Our Strange Skies podcast, and we will be back next week with the beginnings of Robert Bigelow.